Hi, I'm Bella Baker, author of Hecctropssippy Book 1, The Legend of the Land. Here is an excerpt from the second book in the Hecctropssippy series, Hecctropssippy 2, The Will of the Dark Creator, read by Christa Wojciechowski.
A gust of accelerating wind wailed and shrieked like someone being brutally murdered. Anxiety pounded through Arthena's heart as the wind violently shook the shutters and pelted the house with yard debris. Once again, the worst was yet to come. Another life was going to be taken today. A sudden banging on the front door made them jump out of their chairs. Help me, help me. Please, my uncle is missing, screamed a woman's panicking voice. Arthena was the first to hurry to the door. It was Olzenbeth. A chill went down Arthena's back. She had just dreamt about her. Olzenbeth's party streamer hair was disheveled mess from the wind, and she was covered in leaves, grass, and dirt. Arthena closed the door as a forceful gust of wind blew a cloud of dirty debris into the sitting room. Jojoga is gone, and now my Uncle Adnik is missing, Olzenbeth cried. What happened? Asked Burgess as the rest of the family came into the sitting room. Uncle Adnik was right outside in the backyard earlier this morning, cried Olzenbeth on the verge of panic. I was up. My grandparents were up. They were in the kitchen having their tea, and I was tidying my room, which is right by the backyard where I could see my uncle. He knew it was dangerous to be outside during the storm, but he just wanted to quick check on some baby swilgy trees that he had been raising. And he said he'd be right in. I could hear him singing outside from where I was, and then he stopped singing. Olzenbeth began sobbing, and I turned to look, and he wasn't by his trees. So then I went outside to look for him, and he wasn't anywhere in the backyard. She frantically glanced around the sitting room as though she expected Uncle Adnik to appear at any moment. I was calling him and calling him. I looked in the front yard, calling and calling. I looked on the roof and even went back in the house, and I looked in several neighbors' front and backyards, and I can't find him anywhere. He's gone. She broke into more hysterical sobs. Did you go into any of your neighbors' houses and ask him if he was there? Said Dad. Maybe he just stopped over at a neighbor's house to borrow a garden tool, and they got to blabbing, and you just didn't hear them leave with all this wind. He didn't need any garden tools, sobbed Olzenbeth. He was only checking on his trees. I asked all the neighbors if they'd seen him, and they haven't. I'm afraid that a wind column might have sucked him up from the ground and threw him somewhere else. So I need to check your yards. What if he's lying on the ground unconscious somewhere? You've got to help me find him. A gust of wind shrieked like a Skolvik's evil cackle, as though Wojciechowski was laughing about Olzenbeth's terror. What does your uncle look like? Asked Arthena. You know what he looks like, said Olzenbeth, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. He was at Leandro Paul's dinner party with me and my grandparents. We thought that was your brother, said Mom. He was my dad's little brother, said Olzenbeth with a sniffle, or he would have been my dad's brother. My parents died when I was 8. Mom had a deadly lung infection, so of course Dad had to die with her. I don't want to lose my uncle, too. Olzenbeth's crying became hysterical again. He's only 10 years old. Okay, said Dad calmly as he hugged Olzenbeth. We'll all go out there with you and help you find him. I don't want Wilbury going out there, Mom interrupted. Yeah, agreed Wilbury. If I go out there, I'll be dead. He sounded unusually serious. I'll stay here with him, said Mom. Great, let's find something to play, said Wilbury, sounding normal again as he took her hand. Then they headed to his room, debating on whether they should draw pictures or do a puzzle. All right, said Dad, letting go of Olzenbeth, who was slightly calmer. First, we'll search the front yard. Then we'll turn into the side yard on the right side of the house, then the backyard and the left side of the house. If we can't find him, we'll go back inside. And Olzenbeth, I want you to stay here until the storm is over. No, Olzenbeth protested, bursting into sobs again. If we can't find him, we have to keep looking. I know how scared you are for him, Olzenbeth, said Burgess, but we have to consider our own safety too. It's starting to get rough out there, and you know how these summer storms are. We're wasting time standing here and talking. We got to start looking for him now before it gets too dangerous for us. Arthena, get Melmay's lamp. Arthena sprinted into Melmay's room and quickly tapped on her lamp before carrying it to the sitting room. It wasn't as brilliant as the Guardian's search lamps, but the light stone had been generously fed a couple days ago, so it glowed bright enough to guide them. Tabitha, Dad called out. If we don't get back home before the storm ends, it just means we went to the undervillage. All right, Burgess, Arthena, Olzenbeth, Mom yelled back from Wilbury's room. Please be careful out there. We're going to the undervillage. Want to come? Arthena thought, remembering how Olzenbeth, Adnick, Snap, and those other young people disappeared in her nightmare. Okay, said Dad, just as he was about to open the front door. We all know how to get down on the ground. Beat your arms and legs against it as hard as you can and whistle for a grungle if we're stuck out in dangerous weather. But just for safety measures, keep your best whistle. Then he and Arthena took a deep breath and whistled one long, high-pitched note, higher in pitch than any whistling sound a human could make. Olzenbeth's safety whistle was a little too quivery because she was such a nervous wreck, but it would have to do. The thunder had stopped for a while, but the wind was steadily picking up. Let's join arms so we never lose track of each other, said Dad, raising his voice over the wind as they stepped outside. They linked arms. Burgess and Olzenbeth were on either side of Arthena. Since she already had the lamp, Arthena took the job of holding it. Fighting against the forceful winds, they headed down the front walking path and turned down the garden path nearest the house. Arthena couldn't believe she was on another search again. Like with last night's search, she shined the lamp slowly and thoroughly, aiming its beam of light into the darkness of the garden's crowded plants and trees. All while, the three of them tried their hardest to call out Adnick's name over the howls and shrieks of the wind. Arthena was also trying hard not to cry as she was calling him. Being caught out in the middle of a summer storm was one of her worst fears. The last thing she would have imagined herself doing was to willingly go out into one. Saving a child made it worth facing her fear, at least for the first few moments of the search. The end.
Hello, I'm Ross Jeffery. I'm the author of Juniper, Tethered and Tome. This reading is going to be from Tome, which is my latest novel, which is on the recommended reading list for the Stokers this year, which is quite exciting. So I'm just going to read from the prologue because it's a bit, I don't want to give too much away, so I shall commence reading. Light fell into the room from the single small window, the moon outside a large incandescent plate in the sky. Perched on the side of his bed, sweat pouring from his body, Jasper Legg gripped a book. Knuckles white, pages crumpled in his grasp. He sat wrestling with an unforeseen foe boiling up within him. His mind was present, but occupied by the internal struggle, and did not fully register his surroundings. Legg reached a hand up to scratch his stubble. His face pained, haunted like the ghost faces that stared out from the chain-link fences beneath the sign of Arbet macht frei. But Jasper still had work to do before he was a free man. He slid his hand from his face to the back of his neck and gripped the muscles, slowly but powerfully massaging the ever-present ache. The book slid from his lap to the bed, where his hand gripped it just as tightly. Rain thundered off the cars parked outside and slashed through the leaves of the trees. The drain pipe overflowed where moss and leaves hadn't been emptied, and the water dripping became an axe chopping wood on the windowsill. It formed an orchestra of static noise, enough to drive most insane. Jasper was already at that destination, Crazy Town, population 1. The book stayed on the bed as he stood, knees cracking as they extended. He strolled over the rough concrete floor to the window, the dirt of 100 dead men cold beneath his bare feet. He stretched on tiptoes to gaze out at the town asleep in the distance. Lights punctuated the town like town's dark silhouette, as if someone had punctured holes in a piece of card and held it to a bulb. The little dots reminded him briefly that somewhere life was still moving on, without him. Darkness had not won out yet. Jasper's eyes were drawn to the water tower, the moonlight bouncing off its monolithic structure. In the moon's glow, he could see the red and white of the American flag, which decorated the dome. His fingers traced the name of the town etched below the flag, Juniper. The sight helped ground him when he felt lost and alone. His thoughts, although jumbled, were gaining a kind of clarity. A face appeared in the shape of the trees surrounding the prison, where the moonlight was erased in a thick canopy. It was a face he could never forget, his first. Jasper's eyes continued to rove, following the streetlights until he found the place he'd shot Gregory Nelson. Nelson had been sitting at his seat in the town's bustling watering hole, and Jasper didn't take kindly to someone like that getting one over him in his town. Jasper had followed Gregory Nelson out into the night after he refused to give up his seat, and Jasper's constant goading hadn't had the desired effect of starting a brawl. Jasper figured this Gregory was one of those equality types, an entitled, defiant son of a bitch. Jasper had stalked Gregory whilst he was walking down the 701, hugging the shadows, slinking in and out of the ditches like a rattlesnake. When they had gone far enough from town, Jasper had made his move. He'd drawn up alongside Gregory, pulled Gregory into a ditch and shot him 6 times in the head. Once would have been enough, but Jasper wanted to destroy him. When the police had finally found his body a few weeks later, there wasn't much to identify. Coyotes or some other wild animals had been feasting on what remained of him. The skull was completely missing, carried off into the night as a trophy of some sort. His body was a tattered mess. They found his wallet in his jeans pocket, the only thing they had left to identify the body. In the end, the death was put down to a possible hit and run. Wrong place, wrong time. There were other landmarks in Juniper that drew Jasper's attention. The town square where he'd slashed a stranger across the face. The bar where he'd been thrown out more nights for causing various disturbance than he'd actually been let in. The town hall where he'd smashed the window by putting a trash can through it when they'd refused his right to freedom of speech. He'd been telling people how it really was, how Jews and blacks were taking over and that the townsfolk needed purifying. Juniper, that he needed to purify Juniper of this cancerous horde before it was too late. But it was the building out towards the swelling river which now held his attention. The dilapidated, charcoal, roofless skeleton of the building where he'd been apprehended. Jasper had been found at the burning property like some macabre magician that had just appeared out of the smoke. He'd been swaying in time with the undulating grey and black tendrils. The officer that had found him at the scene stated that Jasper had been in some sort of fugue state, an unholy rictus etched across his soot-covered face. His eyes were reported to have been vacant, the only thing living in them, the dancing flame suspended in glassy clarity. He'd been remanded into custody while the town awaited for the fire to be put out and an investigation of the scene to be completed. Many folks had a feeling he'd been arrested for arson, but would soon be out to terrorise the town once more. A lot of shit was slung his way, but none of it ever stuck. How wrong they ended up being. When the smoke had cleared and the firefighters had dampened the inferno, the authorities made the grisly discovery of 7 bodies, charred and shriveled up like long dead flies on a window ledge, arms and legs drawn into what remained of their bodies. It became clear that many despicable acts had been carried out by Jasper. The prosecutor at the trial had pronounced that Juniper had its very own Ed Gein to put them on the map. Each corpse had been decapitated. The heads were never discovered. Jasper had giddily announced that he would be taking that secret to the grave. The remains, all unidentifiable, were picked over by investigators like vultures over carrion. They had found short, sharpened poles which appeared to have been embedded in the flesh pre-death through various orifices. Teeth marks had marked the bones. It became clear once the bones had been washed, those marks were not made by wild animals, but the beast that was Jasper. Large steel nails jutted out of the crispy, carbon-rich flesh of those bodies that had been discovered near the outskirts of the blaze. A sadistic game of pin the tail on the donkey had been played on all those that had tried to crawl from the flames. The psychopath had had fun with them before finally snuffing out their lives. Jasper lowered his frame, slipping down from tiptoes, ankles clicking as they were released of the tension that they held him there during his reverie. He robotically slunk back to his bed and collapsed on the hard mattress. He reached under his pillow and pulled out a letter. As Jasper turned it over in his hands, he stopped and began to stare at the address written on the front. He held it, fingering the script and tracing the ink with his fingers. Something moved behind him. His fingers tightened against the enveloped letter, crinkling the edge. He glanced frantically over his shoulder and observed the walls of his cell. The solid beam of ivory light carved up the darkness of his dwelling, separating it into above and below. The darkest corners of the room seemed to swell as if something was lurking, breathing within them, its bulk falling with each exhalation. He tried to pierce the black voids as he stared into them, but fear gripped him. His neck hurt and he stretched further forwards, trying to locate the sound, a sound that seemed so out of place. Unsure if he were dreaming or not, Jasper tried to filter out both the noise of the rain, which continued its downpour in the sheets outside his window, and the dissonance of any other tiny sound fighting with each other to be heard. Here! The voice seemed to claw through the gritted teeth of someone unseen, a breath that continued until the word had been exhaled and abruptly ceased. Jasper shook his head. Was his mind playing tricks on him again? He couldn't pinpoint the noise. It appeared to start in the upper corner of the room and finish in the lowest corner. Moving through the utter darkness, he reached behind him, picking up the book. No, not now, he blurted out. That's my little...
Yeah, you're getting applause.
Good morning. I'm Clennell Anthony, and the excerpt that we're going to read is from my book called Fractured. It's about a young woman who is visually impaired, who was recently abused by her ex, and the scene that's going to be read to you is the first time she meets the love interest for this novel.
Fractured by Clennell Anthony. Jaden wasn't looking for Samira, but when he saw her, he couldn't help following in her wake. He hadn't seen her at first. It was her smell that caught him off guard. There was something about her scent that always made him want to follow her like a hound on the hunt. She was prey to his predator, and everybody knew that the wolf in sheep's clothes always caught its fleecy and rather tasty little lamb. Jaden stared after Samira and the guy walking next to her. He hadn't expected to find Samira by going shopping, nor had he expected to find her this fast, but there she was. Samira was just right there walking with some guy. His name tag read Josiah. The name was indelibly seared into Jaden's mind, and he wondered if Samira and Josiah were already screwing. He didn't pay attention to the blue vest Josiah wore or the fact that he worked there. It didn't occur to him that she may have been getting help from a stranger. He only saw her with another man, and it burned his insides. He wanted so badly to walk up to the jerk and slam his hunting blade into his heart and grab Samira, throw her over his shoulder like a Neanderthal, and carry her off back to his rather modern cave to teach her a very valuable lesson in betrayal and what it would cost her. He would punish her for the time he'd spent looking for her. For 3 weeks he looked for her. He hadn't seen her at work or at her mother's house. Now here she was in Walmart, shopping with some guy he didn't recognize. They were talking to each other and working together to put things in her shopping cart. He saw the gym bag, the briefcase, and purse she took to work. So she had been going to work, he thought, as he trailed them through the store, forgetting to shop for himself. He was so transfixed on the cozy tableau she and her new lover made. In his mind, he saw the man dead, a bullet to the head, a knife in the back, or his hands around the man's throat as he strangled the life out of him. Samira was his, and no one could have her. When she looked back, he smiled, knowing she wouldn't see him. He knew her. He knew everything about her. She wouldn't see him because she couldn't see far enough to make out his facial features. All she would see was his outline. He knew because he lived with her for nearly 2 years. She'd regret leaving him, and she'd eventually come back to him. He'd follow her all the way back to wherever it was she moved to. He knew she'd moved because he'd called her brother up in Massachusetts to find out the news. He knew she wouldn't tell her brother everything. He had lied about the fight they had, and Derek believed him. Derek didn't give Jaden the new address or phone number, but told him that Samira had moved and was determined that she wouldn't marry him. You fix this, Jay, Derek demanded. Sure, I'll fix it, Jaden soothed. She's just mad right now. You know how women are, and you know even better how Samira is. Yeah, well, Sam's not the type to get mad over nothing. I'm sure if I should be telling you anything, but she's all right, doing well from what Mom says. I'll try to talk to her for you. No need. I'll see what I can do first. If I think I need your help, I'll let you know. All right, I gotta go. I'm being paged. I'll talk to you later. Fool, Jaden said, his tone derisive. He slid his fingers across the screen of the phone to turn it off and started thinking of his next moves. Now he didn't have to plot. He'd just follow the bitch back to wherever she lived and start his campaign from there. He knew Samira all right. She was stubborn. and nothing and no one could talk her into coming back to him if she'd made up her mind about it. He didn't think his apologies and charm would work, but he'd find a way to make her see, or he'd just have to kill her. If I can't have her, no one will. He trilled the asinine little cliche in his mind, especially not the jerk shopping with her now. He started to hum to himself as he trailed after the little scene of coziness in front of him, growing angrier all the while he watched her interact with the jerk with the wild hair, tall, huge body, and what he assumed was a rather inferior mind. Samara felt hunted, stalked. She kept feeling a tingle of dread down her spine, and the hairs at the nape of her neck kept standing on end. It was weird, but she could almost imagine she could actually smell Jaden's woodsy cologne. She tried to pay attention to her shopping. She couldn't see her list as she printed it out in small print, but she remembered it well. Still, she couldn't fight the feeling that she was being followed. She looked over her shoulder, but no one was there that she could recognize. She blew out a breath of frustration. She knew her limitations, especially when it came to her sight. She could only see so far. It wasn't like she'd be able to see if someone was far enough away. Maybe I'm just paranoid, she thought, and turned back to the shelves of pasta. You all right? Cy asked. Sam stood, a frown on her face, a look of deep contemplation burning in her variegated eyes, her lips pressed together in a straight line, and her fingers trembling on the items she held in her hands as she spaced out on him. He must have seen her preoccupation and noticed her frustration, she realized. She smiled up at him and nodded. You don't seem all right to me, he observed. I'm just restless and antsy. I hate Walmart, she told him. She gave him part of the truth. She did hate Walmart. It was always so full of people. No one watched where they were going, and everyone was in a hurry. People bumped into her as if they couldn't see her. It was weird. It seemed like soon as people walked into Walmart, they became strange and unusual. It was something to hate, she thought, but the prices were better and she was working on a budget for the time being. Getting her name taken from the lease, putting her stuff in storage for a few weeks, and renting a new house dug into her savings. The police officers on her case informed her that Jaden got off with a slap on the hand, probation, and community service, as it was his first offense and yada yada. She really didn't care what happened to him so long as he stayed the hell away from her. She was getting preoccupied again, she thought, as Cy started to move the cart and she wasn't moving with him. She was just standing there staring into space. Keep up, Sam, she told herself, and put her hands on the cart again and continued to shop.
I am Jay Cox. I write nonfiction, and I'm also working on the first book of a sci-fi trilogy called Fulfilling a Vow, Searching for Answers. This particular excerpt comes out of the third chapter. The protagonist is actually, I would say, kind of clamped down to a bed. You won't fully kind of grasp all that, but you'll kind of see it at the very end of it. And she's having a really bad day because she reacted badly to, what's the word I'm looking for? The anesthesia. Yeah, it didn't mix with her alien physiology. But anyhow, yeah, I'll just jump right into the scene here. His eyes bulged. The swift thrust of a fist smashing into his gut crumpled him to the floor. So it was you they hired. His voice trailed. Kimojawa's thoughts sloshed from one side of his head to the other. He quickly came to, realizing that the hazy dark object was indeed a booted foot shoving down towards his face. Catching it in between his hands, he leapt forward, twisting their ankle. Wasting no time, his assailant's slender frame rolled into the air from the propulsion of their other leg, kicking out at Kimojawa's exposed head, just brushing across the front of his lab coat as he leaned backward. Oui, oui, Monsieur Kimojawa, le mort de dame à votre service, she replied, rising from the floor, making a curtsy but grasped thin air rather than address, since she was donned in midnight black fatigues. Her lips curled into a wry smile as Kimojawa fixated upon her, assuming a fighting stance. Her tongue licked slowly across the upper part of her plump trout pout lips. You have such a strong grip. Let's play some more, she cooed. Such swift reflexes. Every one of her blows bludgeoned him like a lead pipe. If he had not focused his own ki to reinforce his body, those blows would have been fatal. Even so, her relentless assault mixed with the fact that he was still recovering from that initial sucker punch put him at a severe disadvantage. At this rate, he would not hold up much longer. Seeing an opening, he crouched and sprung forward, dodging his head left. Avoiding a jab to the face, he channeled his ki into his twisting arm and on into his fist, ready to end it all in one blow. He realized the ruse as soon as his knuckles halted against abs wound as tight as steel coils, absorbing every bit of that fatal blow. Just as he retracted his arm, Lady Death leapt into the air and clenched his waist between her legs, locking his head into a powerful sleeper hold. Her thick, muscled thighs clamped his waist like the powerful jaws of an alligator, squeezing tighter with each depression of his diaphragm. His chest exploded with excruciation from fiery lancets, stabbing into his lungs. Desperately, he fought the beckoning low of the Sandman's song. If only I could. He fainted, but managed to regain consciousness. It was now or never. He smiled, hearing a mild grunt as Lady Death's body made impact with the wall, but she only tightened her hold. His time was short. He had to keep trying. Just a little more. You play so rough, monsieur, she cooed as he slammed her against the wall once again. Brilliant idea, trying to activate the door and force us out, but I won't allow it to go your way. Bonne nuit and sweet dreams, Monsieur Kimojawa. Kimojawa's mind clouded over. Miniature's glowing eyes was the last thing he witnessed before his world faded to black. Lady Death took him down to the floor with that last bit of pressure, holding him for a moment longer to ensure he wouldn't be getting back up. She winked. Ma chérie, don't worry, the doctor is just out for a while. Her eyes fell shut and she took in a deep breath. What a tasty hors d'oeuvre he was. Rising to her feet, she strutted towards Minitra. Champagne brown eyes squinted, peering through the eyelets of a midnight black masquerade mask, encrusted with black diamonds. Black glitter decorated the interior of paisleys outlined in white with groups of ebony black diamonds at the center of their heads. At its center, the largest of the diamonds rested in an arch that rose up about half an inch in the middle of the top part of the mask, at the center of her brow. Her tongue licked between her lips as she looked upon Minitra's contorted face. She now stood at the head of the bed. Such intense eyes, ma chérie. They have seen much death, no? She purred, combing her slender, manicured fingers through silky raven black tresses. Lifting a cupped handful of hair, she closed her eyes and sniffed long and deep. Her shoulders scrunched up towards her ears, allowing the full redolence of a rose to fill her nostrils. Her body shuddered with delight. Curled fingers closed and twisted, entangling raven black locks around them as Lady Death's eyes snapped open. Her lips stretched with a malicious grin. Minitra winced, her teeth gritted behind pressed lips, refusing to give her tormentor any additional pleasure. As suspected, chérie, you'll be a tasty dish indeed. Grinning, she sprinkled the clump of hair she'd ripped from Minitra's head onto her face.
Hello, my name is Patty Lesser. My website is pattylesser.com, and I have published 10 novels, a variety of genres like thriller, sci-fi, mystery, adventure, etc. The book I'm reading from today is The Devil, Angels, and Demons. A rogue demon wants his own hell, and he will go to war with the devil and a chosen woman to get it. It's a paranormal fantasy, and I will read you an excerpt. After a few minutes and some drops of oil, I rotated the metal disc. It wouldn't budge upwards, but it easily pulled downwards. I rotated it clockwise until I heard it click into place. There was no handle to pull the fire back towards me, so I decided it must move out. I placed my hands on the top right corner and pushed. It moved, but something held it back. I ran my head down the lower right side of the fire back and found another serrated disc near the bottom. How long since this has been opened? I shoved, but it only budged a few inches. I squatted inside the fireplace to allow for a better footing, and then I attacked the fire back with all my strength. In time, I forced it open wide enough to squeeze through. After grabbing a flashlight, I entered the dark, hollow cavern. The air smelled dank and earthy, and it felt cold and crisp. When I stood up, I turned on the flashlight and found myself surrounded by smooth walls, a flat floor, and a curved ceiling, all fashioned from earth. There was no distinctive patterns or designs. I touched the dark wall, and it was rough and cold. I shone my flashlight to the right and then to the left. The light revealed two similar tunnels. I analyzed the tunnel to the left of the fire back. Though physically similar to the one on the right, I perceived small differences, an indentation here and crevices there. Something was odd about this path, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I was drawn further and further into the abyss. I trod slowly at first, afraid of what I might find. I shone the flashlight and generated a circular motion, allowing me to view every aspect of the dark tunnel. I looked at my watch from time to time because I didn't want to wander too far or too long. Suddenly, a sudden chill in the still air caused me to shiver. My nose detected a faint, sweet odor from ahead. As I proceeded, I searched a spacious chamber. I blazed my flashlight around the room and discovered rows upon rows of black metal lockers, resembling those you might find in a school hallway. As I proceeded past the room, the odor faded. 2 meters from the locker room was another chamber. When I looked inside, I was surprised to see only few lockers. I left that room and continued further down the tunnel where another room appeared, but nothing was inside. My heart raced as if I had run a 100-meter race, and my thoughts spiraled like an F4 twister. Every nerve in my body felt on edge. I had to get out of the passageway. If my curiosity hadn't been stronger than my fear, I would have returned to the fireplace. The panicky perception diluted once I set foot back into the locker room. I felt a little more at peace than out in the passageway. I illuminated the area with my flashlight, attempting to identify the cause of the sweet aroma, but found only black lockers. They lined all 4 walls from the floor to the ceiling with no markings or distinguishing figures of any kind. They were identical. I stared at the earthen floor and discovered footprints. I hadn't noticed them before. I didn't know why they were not visible in the tunnel. I should have looked more closely. I studied the prints and noticed they seemed to be formed by the same shoe, much bigger than mine. They led from the room's entranceway to the metal lockers. For a few minutes, I followed each imprint with my flashlight until I tired of that exercise. I called out, "Hello? Is anybody there?" A few moments passed, but there was no response. I examined the lockers again, ultimately resolving to pry one open. I grasped the handle of the door closest to me, but it was rusty and required a little prodding. Finally, I forced it open. Eagerly, I shone my flashlight into its emptiness. Nothing was inside, not even a shelf. It was just an empty space from top to bottom, but it was exceptionally clean and shiny. Yet there again was that sweetish odor, like the smell of honey, but stronger than before. I slammed the locker shut. Suddenly I quivered as an iciness cut into my shoulder blades and shot down my legs. I was determined to leave this room immediately. I had to depart that cryptic cave. Would my flashlight go out? Was something or someone going to attack me? I was a bundle of nerves. My legs shook and my hand trembled. I had an uncontrollable urge to scream. Sprinting out of the locker room, I turned right and kept my flashlight aimed at the ground and the right wall. I followed the mud tunnel as fast as I could, but the eerie sensation would not go away. At length, I reached the fire back. I scampered into the fireplace and locked the framework with shaky hands. When I was confident it was secured, I scurried upstairs to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and gulped down some orange juice from the carton. Once my breathing returned to normal, I analyzed my feelings. I was scared, but I didn't remember feeling panicky until I opened the locker door. Was something in that empty locker? There was no way I was going to return to that strange room. The end.
Hi, I'm Sara Cristia HJ. I write romance, drama, and historical with magic realism. I will read today an excerpt of my short story called The Witch's Amulet. I hope you like it. The old bridge spread before Delinda, and the river underneath rumbled on the rocks covered with moss. Years had passed since a person laid a foot on that bridge, and less crossed it. However, on the other side, the forest encouraged the young woman to fetch what her heart longed for, the amulet to bring her beloved Devin back, and only the ancient witch could make it for her. The villagers had warned Delinda about going to the older sorceress, because no one who dared to meet her had returned. They said those seekers became food to the demons that wandered in the woods. Yet the long nights Delinda had embraced with sorrow, waiting for Devin to come back from battle, had instilled courage in her. Inhaling the humid air, Delinda walked down the bridge with firm steps. Once she crossed it, she looked back and smiled. Nothing happened to her. She was confident enough to go on. As Delinda stepped into the forest, a cold wind whistled, and her long red hair shivered upon her waist. A chill ran throughout her thin body as she halted and listened to the chirping of birds and crickets, the hooting of owls, the rattling of crows, and the cracking of wood. The forest was talking to her, or was it warning her? Delinda shook the doubts out of her head and walked between the beech and oak trees until time didn't matter anymore. Finally, she arrived at a clearing with lilac and white buds growing everywhere. Delinda heard a strange shriek in the distance, but her heart was deaf, her limbs numb, and her senses shut to beauty or surprise. The shadows crept up the silent trunks, and she lay on the comforting grass, breathing the green, moist scent and letting the wings of darkness embrace her. "I need to sleep," she whispered to the void. "No, you must go on. Keep searching for the old witch before it's too late for Devin," a voice ordered in her mind. Delinda stood up and walked with hefty steps to the border of the woods. Suddenly, the sounds of the forest became sharper. She stopped. "Don't listen to them. One more step, dear, and you'll reach your destiny. One more step," the voice hissed. Delinda entered the woods, and everything around her went silent. Not a shriek, not a crow, not a whistle, not a sign of life. However, she dragged herself between the leafless trees, their trunks with expressions of horror and wonder of their own. "I must do this for Devin." "Devin," Delinda repeated, because she was forgetting why she was there. The forest was consuming her memories. Within a short time, Delinda found herself in a spot as ancient as the Kalevala. She stood in front of a cave covered with a dried honeysuckle curtain. "You're finally here," said the voice, not in her head this time, but it echoed from inside the cave. What came out could have startled anyone, but Delinda seemed to have expected it. A slender shape in black appeared behind the dried leaves as bony fingers pushed them away to let her pass. Long silver locks and a wrinkled face showed the traces of ages on the pale, almost translucent skin. But the most horrendous was the blurred blackness that replaced the eyes and the sharp yellow teeth that smiled wickedly at her. "What do you want, Delinda?" Delinda shivered as if a cold blast woke her from a nightmare. Her eyes fixed in the ghostly face of the witch while her mind wandered among her thoughts. Remember, Delinda, she told herself. You came to stay with me. The witch's silhouette floated to Delinda, whose mouth dropped open as the cold fingers grabbed a red lock of her hair. Will you remain with me? The witch asked, shaking Delinda to her core. Delinda shook her head. No, someone is waiting for me. Who, Delinda? Who's waiting for you? Delinda lowered her gaze. For a moment, she thought she saw out of the corners of her eyes the roots of the trees shifting, but she remained quiet. A long-gone love has drained you from your life, Delinda, but let me feel you again. The witch whispered by her ear and smelled her hair. The old sorceress brought her index finger to the white, soft flesh of Delinda's neck. With a small scratch from her pointed yellow nail, a drop of blood poured from the dentist's slit, and with her viper-like tongue, the witch licked it. Mesmerized by the sorceress's poison, Delinda's lips drew a faint smile. The shadows danced around her as the roots of the trees crawled to her feet. They caressed her ankles and thighs and waist as the rough tubers pulled her slowly down. Tiny thorns drew out of the roots and trespassed her clear skin. Lying in the middle of the gloomy forest while the trees sucked her blood, Delinda remembered her love for Devon and the amulet to bring him back. Yet she was at peace. The roots offered a sweet comfort to her suffering. The witch's laugh was distant but delightful, for soon the trees began to wear their forgotten greenery again, while the forest drained Delinda out of strength. Nonetheless, before her soul drifted away, the sorceress left the amulet in Delinda's open palm.
Okay, I'm Mollie McClure, and I'm reading from a creative nonfiction novel that I'm writing called Talking to the Moon. The title of this chapter is The Center of Everything. Excuse me. The houses stood so close together that when viewed from a distance, they seemed to touch. Perhaps that's why Kat, at 7 years old, imagined that people didn't grow up in the Rockwall neighborhood, they grew out of it, as if it had some sort of creative life force. When some new little kid appeared outside, just at the age when playpens and fenced-in backyards were no longer needed, Kat simply assumed they'd been born to the street. After all, the children in her neighborhood knew each other more by their houses than their surnames. When asking to invite a new friend over, they told their parents, he's from the house with the blue door, or she's from the house on the corner. Kat thought even the adults had arrived in this way, magically produced by the houses long, long ago. Across the street from the Moore's house, in the middle of the neighborhood where the two dead ends met, stood the crumbling wall the neighborhood had been named after. 70 or 80 feet of old rocks some farmer dragged from a creek bed 100 or so years ago, when the neighborhood was just a field on the outskirts of what would become Cincinnati. There were only 2 streets in the neighborhood, and the wall stood at the end of one and the beginning of the other, which led to the question, did the rock wall connect the neighborhood's houses and families, or did it separate them? This was something Kat didn't know because she, a girl whose days were filled with questions like, what is the bluest blue and where do stars go in the morning, hadn't yet thought to ask, even to herself. It was there at the rock wall across from the Moore's house and under the streetlight where the neighborhood men like to gather on spring and summer evenings. Excuse me. They leaned against the wobbly creek stone, many with a lit cigarette in one hand and a bottle of cheap beer in the other. Their talk centered on motors, money, or other manly things, with the occasional joke thrown in for good measure. The raunchier, the better. And with the men out of the way, the women washed dinner dishes, tidied up, and put the littlest of their children to bed. The older children played nighttime games of kick the can or ghost in the graveyard up and down the street, while younger ones played near the wall. Some walked along the wall with outstretched arms, testing their balance at what seemed like a death-defying height, the nearby fathers offering a cushion of protection against a possible fall. Beyond the wall and just a few houses to the right of the moors, the neighborhood sidewalk pavement met the smooth, worn dirt edging the woods. This was an almost mile-long strip of trees and bushes and brambles, and it stretched all the way from the rock wall neighborhood to the imposing chain link fence that surrounded the Cincinnati Zoo. Each new generation of older neighborhood children claimed the woods as their domain. Kat's teenage brother Daniel met his friends there to try out BB guns or work on a never-ending tree fort project. Jean Marie and her friends picked wildflowers, played elaborate games of hide and seek, and did those things children of 10 and 12 do when hidden from adult eyes. And Kat dreamed of the day she'd be grown up enough to leave the constrictions of front yard and sidewalk behind and join her older siblings in the woods. But on rainy Saturday or summer afternoons, when creek walking, tree climbing, and even bike riding was out of the question, the neighborhood children, no matter what age they were, gravitated to the Moore's house. They came because they knew Kat, Jean Marie, and Daniel's mother, Mrs. Moore to them, would make a space for them, the kind of space only the best kind of mothers know how to make. And along with that space, she would give them something to do. On some days, the porch looked like an open air carnival as children sat in groups of 4 and 5, some using pennies as ante for card games, some pulling bits of crayons from an old Folgers can to draw on the long strips of butcher paper Lou always had on hand. Occasionally, the children begged to play in the cool of the Moore's unfinished basement, and Lou squirted dishwashing soap on the cement floor, then turned on the shower head Walter had installed on one of the basement walls. Even Daniel and his friends, who usually considered themselves too grown up to play with the younger kids, couldn't resist the chance to kick off tennis shoes and flip-flops, run their toes through a blue line of soapy foam, then pretend to ride the bubbly surf on a wild ocean wave, slipping and sliding from one end of the big open basement to the other. Upstairs, Lou could usually be found in the kitchen, starting one meal or cleaning up after another, or making her way down the long list of weekly chores Walter created for her. At least once or twice a week, she pulled her long black hair into a bun and put on a loose top and an old baggy pair of pants, then wiped the kitchen walls down. Once finished, she dropped to her hands and knees and scrubbed the faded gold squares of the linoleum kitchen floor. She inched along, pushing an old towel and a bucket along with her, the bucket making scraping announcements of her progress. As she worked, her top swayed back and forth, and thick, damp tendrils of her hair fell against her neck, her sweat mixing with the traces of constant attempts to push her hair back. Scrubbing and pushing, she cradled the kitchen phone's chunky black receiver under her chin, pulling the long cord tighter and tighter as she worked. "Don't even think about it," she called out over her shoulder whenever one of her children ran up the concrete steps of the tiny side porch and stopped, panting, bodies leaning forward, wanting to take that last step or two over the threshold so he or she could plop down, feet sprawled out in front of them, arms thrown over the vinyl padded backs of the kitchen chairs. Sometimes, after hearing her caution, the child made the trek around to the front door, grumbling, to sit on the threshold and wait for her to call that the coast was clear. Other times, they hesitated outside the door for just a second, barely breaking stride before moving on. They didn't really need to go in. They just needed to hear her voice and know she was there, sometimes working, sometimes talking on the phone, but still there, ready for them like the safe base in a game of tag. The voice on the other end of the telephone line was usually one of the neighborhood women who, like their children, recognized Lou as a safe haven. As Lou and the other women worked in their houses, cradling phones under their chins and telling each other the tiny details of the ongoing stories of their days, no momentous decisions were made or life-altering advice given. But day after day, their shared thoughts and secrets traveled back and forth telephone lines high above the street, becoming intertwined eventually, like thick, strong threads capable of holding even the oldest of tapestries together. The end.
My name is Dan Markowski. I live in Michigan in the United States, and I mostly write fantasy and horror. Today I'm going to be reading a short story. This story was inspired by a historical photograph from about the early 1900s. It's a photo of an older gentleman standing next to a little girl on top of a horse. And the name of the story is called The Last Ride. Such a fine specimen, Joseph said to himself as much as he was speaking to the farmer approaching his stable. The man was leading a horse, dark as midnight, with white streaks along the flanks. The farmer, hearing the words, beamed. Best horse in the land, I guarantee it. Thunder is the name. He's real friendly and has a calm demeanor, as requested. Joseph ushered him inside and walked over to his desk to retrieve payment for Thunder. Mr. Wesley will be quite pleased, he said with a smile. Well, I'm honored to supply a horse for the richest man in town, the farmer replied. Joseph returned with a sack of coins and noticed the farmer staring at a picture that was tacked on the wall years ago. Who is the young one with you atop the horse, Joseph? Is that Miss Rose? No, Joseph sighed. Her older sister, Maisie. She perished in a terrible accident while out riding one day. The horse spooked Easy and threw her off. She was such a sweet girl. A tragedy, the farmer replied. I'm surprised Mr. Wesley allows Miss Rose to ride after that. He didn't, at least not until Rose was a teenager. She has a way of getting what she wants, and Mr. Wesley will do anything to make his only living daughter happy. Joseph fought back the bile that was rising in his throat as he said that. The two men said their goodbyes, and Joseph led Thunder to his stall. He grabbed a brush and began to groom him until the sun went down. Then he lit a lantern and moved on to care for the other horses in the stable. By the time he finished, it was well into the night and his back ached. It was a reminder that he was getting too old for this, but he loved the horses too much to retire from his job as stable master. The final visit to Thunder showed he was getting comfy in the straw, and the light of the lantern shone on his face. His kind eyes looked at Joseph, and he whinnied softly. Joseph grimaced. None of the other horses here were fit for Rose to ride, or at least that's what he told Mr. Wesley. Thunder would be different. He had to be. Rose took to Thunder immediately. So beautiful, she said. A week went by, and Joseph thought perhaps she had finally found her perfect match. As more time passed, however, he noticed some changes. Rose's initial glee began to dissipate. The rides were becoming shorter as well. The situation came to a head one afternoon when she returned to the stable after a very short while. Joseph's stomach felt like it was twisted in knots when he saw the scowl on Rose's face as she hopped off Thunder and immediately boxed one of the animal's ears. Thunder snorted and stomped the ground while Joseph rushed over to grab the reins and try to keep the agitated horse under control. I'm sick of this dumb creature, Rose shrieked. It moves so slow. Such a bore. I want to go fast. Miss Rose, please, Joseph's voice quivered as he knew what was coming next. He began to escort Thunder into the stable as fast as he could. Joseph, the shrill voice made him freeze in mid-step. Put him down. A chill ran down Joseph's spine. No, miss, you can't mean that. I'm telling Daddy, he'll make it happen. He'll put that beast down. She stormed off while Joseph sank to his knees and clutched his chest. Weeks went by, and Joseph spent his time in isolation. A concerned Mr. Wesley came calling one day to inquire why he hadn't found a new horse for his daughter yet. Joseph lied and said he had fallen ill, but he knew that excuse would only work for so long. During another sleepless night, Joseph became lost in his thoughts. It was always something with Rose. The horse was too slow, not friendly enough, didn't listen, made too much noise. Eventually, they all shared the same fate. There would be no satisfying that spoiled child. He needed a solution or the cycle would never end. After much deliberation, he found his answer, and then he sobbed himself to sleep. Days later, Joseph trudged toward his stable, a new horse in tow. This one was all brown with a wild mane of hair. He deliberately left the county for this newest acquisition. It was best if nobody knew who he was or who he worked for. The ranch he purchased it from was taken aback when Joseph expressed interest in making the purchase. Fella, this one's no good for riding. He loses patience real quick and will start bucking like crazy until he gets you on the ground. Be lucky if you don't get a broken leg or worse in the process. That was all Joseph needed to hear to seal the deal. The next morning, Joseph was up early to prepare Rose's new horse. When she came to the stable and saw him, her smile was a mile wide. He's so pretty. What's his name? The seller hadn't told Joseph if the horse had a name. He scratched his chin thoughtfully and replied, "His name is Karma." The end.
If you don't know already, I'm Christa Wojciechowski. I'm a self-published author of dark fiction, and I am the founder of the Writers Mastermind, and I live in Panama. So if you hear any roosters behind my story, that is why. This story is called Observer Dependent Universe. It's a story I was working on for the advanced creative writing class with Richard Thomas. It's still a work in progress, but I think it's fit for human ears. Okay. The rain streaking down the window makes me crave a home I never had, an epigenetic memory threaded into my DNA. No matter that this precipitation will sear canyons into my flesh if I ever step outside to stretch my arms and soak in it, bash the glass and tumble into the gray amber sunset to melt under drops of sulfuric acid. This is comforting on two levels. One, I get a cozy feeling that we must have felt on the planet we were made from, where nature made it so that the sound of rain tempered our restlessness with melatonin. We don't ask for it, yet the sleeping potion is released, cued by dark skies, allowing our minds to dissipate like the fog that lifts from the lake of poison next to our current base. The second consolation is that death is waiting just outside this door. If only I could meet it halfway. Your sustenance is ready, the voice from the ceiling says. It's a strangely tender voice, like that of an aunt whom you never talked to, but have always loved because you were her favorite. I scramble to the unit where my meal awaits behind a clear door. It opens as soon as my hand comes within range. I am hungry, and I do not complain about this pile. Food is food, and salivary glands flood my mouth on cue. I eat, like a primordial creature wriggling in the ooze, pressing my lips to the plate and sucking it through my parted mouth without a slurp. I ingest, parted mouth that was pressed to you, to your shoulder, to the head of the organ between your legs. I swallow, my stomach hungry for the pace, loud and roiling. If my limbic system fails in its graceful and undulating peristalsis, pushing the molecules through my inner tubing, I starve. If it malfunctions in some way, the follicles will not absorb the nutrients within the sludge, but it works in mindless efficiency. I feel the sustenance break down, the glucose already entering my cells, each one of them in the warm afterglow of renewed energy. They are happy. I am not. I talk to the body, will it to stop. It's running on a program without my consent, billions of years old, that began with the first prokaryotes. Funny how the cells, all separate little worlds, cooperate in this alliance of which I am blocked from participating. I ask it, how can you disobey me? How can you make me hungry when I don't want to be? How can you force me to take my next breath when all I want to do is stop breathing? I didn't give you permission, not for this breath either. And I know that even if I could crash through the dome and lay supine under the drizzle, the pain would trigger a reflex that would have me leap to the closest shelter before I had a chance to make a deliberate choice to stay under the shower of acid, to let the flesh separate from my bones and seep into the alien ground. But part of me has prevented myself from doing anything drastic. Part of me, purely out of morbid curiosity, is simply wondering if you'll come back. I fall asleep listening to the pulse behind my ear, relentless. This body isn't mine. It never was. Yours isn't either. Silo, silo, come the rain and cleanse the system. At dawn, when the slide moon cusps the mountain range, this is our time to rise. We are startled awake by the kind of voice in the ceiling, the voice of someone who no doubt died decades ago. All that remains of her is a nameless, disembodied vibration. We go to our posts beneath the sky pavilion, a wide convex structure that distorts the inhospitable vile green skies and the slick and jagged land outside, making it seem more wondrous and monstrous than it probably is. The dome, a god's magnifying glass, and we are an experiment. It is possibility that is poisonous. Dressed in threadbare sleeveless shirts and underwear, our slick rubbery skin prickles in the damp. Again, this physiological reaction I did not mandate, did not want to show that I felt anything. I vowed to be beyond sensation, and yet my skin reacts to the world outside. The organism continues to disobey me. The cells conspire against me. Get into formation, the general shouts. Spittle flies from her mouth, her eyes yellowed like they've been stained by the jaundiced light that radiates from the skies beyond the glass. Her oily hair is tacked under a saturated cap. She shines like obsidian, tarnished as if from a black sun, dirty yet clean like polished steel. 12 and 12. We do our exercises, 12 of each. Push-up, burpee, squat jack, plank, dips, lunges, sit-ups, fly jacks, mountain climbers, high knees, skips, scissor jacks. We do only 12 reps because it is enough to retain our fitness for flight without requiring excessive oxygen, water, and calories. It's moments like these when I'm standing in muster or straining myself to the point of exhaustion that I replay our conversations, talking into cameras with imitation wine-stained teeth. If we thought about the light years between us, we would choke with panic. Mercifully, the human brain was fitted for our small world. We can't think big enough. Impossible to consider that maybe we never mattered at all. Okay, so that's my excerpt.
I'm going to do a reading from my book, Dark Hilarity, which is coming out in January. Whoop, whoop, available for pre-order now. And my name is Joseph Sale, and I write a range of genres, but usually there's some element of fantasy involved. I describe this as heavy metal portal fantasy, but it's actually quite a lot about my upbringing, which is very strange. And you probably worked this out already from the moment I opened my mouth, but I am British, and I'm currently reading this to you from Winchester. So here we go. Oh, and the one other thing you need to know is the year is 1997. Most stories start with waking up. This one starts with falling asleep. The cretin sat on a box of used things, one of many littered around the soon-to-be vacant apartment, staring out of bay windows overlooking the as-yet unwounded skyline of New York. Sunlight was fast fading from the cityscape, vanishing behind the temples of glazed glass. The apartment was bare, grey and soulless, a stripped container with 4 walls in which all his packaged worldly goods would be stored for the night before the removal team came in the morning. His instruments, the only thing he really cared about, were already on their way to Los Angeles by other means. The cretin took in the boxy grandeur of the Rockefeller building, the broadsword blade of the Empire State piercing the clouds, and the twin monolithic towers of the World Trade Center like chromed slabs of ancient stone stolen from Celtic moorland and dumped amidst the architecture of modernity. It was the last time he would look at them for a while, so he wanted to savor their shape and color, and above all, the sheer arrogant bravado of their design. Clearly, the men and women that had constructed these modern ziggurats had never heard of the Tower of Babel and the moral lesson of overreaching. He smiled at the thought. His lips were so thin they were virtually non-existent, making his mouth look like a wound in his face, pregnant with white teeth. Despite its ugliness, there were men and women who would kill to kiss that mouth, would kill to feel one touch from him. Valentine Killshot, his band, his own towering monolith of ego, had signed an incredibly large record deal with Warner Bros., so large that it would change their way of life forever. The 4 band members thought they had lived well before. It had been a long time, after all, since the days of driving a beaten-down van from one dive bar to the next, of writing songs in cold, abandoned studios manned only by failed art students who still believed the industry lie that the cream always rose to the top. 9 years, in fact, since Jed had first picked out the chord that would become their calling card track, Wolftown. Nothing happened that wasn't willed. That was a law of life that Jed Main knew well. In the same way, nothing came into being of its own accord. Nothing was self-created, except perhaps being itself, the forces that govern the ineluctable cosmos. Fawning journalists would beg for Jed's insight, ask how he created such storms of sound, how he managed to trap emotions inside chord progressions, transmute physical experience into a drug-like auditory dose. The answer was simple. He didn't. He didn't create the sounds any more than the blacksmith created the ore and base metal they worked with to fashion a blade. He drew them from someplace else and forged them into a shape of his desiring. It was time to revisit that place. The record label would be looking for Valentine Killshot's 4th album soon. A world tour was planned, starting in Los Angeles, which would become Jed and the band's new home, and eventually venturing across the globe. He already had an inkling of an album title, a few disparate melodies, but he needed to concretize them, to hear and see and feel them. Jed fidgeted absently with a brandy glass in his pale fingers. Dregs of dark liquid sat at the bottom. Unlike many musicians who grew calluses from the frequency of their practice, Jed's hands were like a doll's, childlike and unblemished. His body was disgustingly thin. Even his skinny jeans hung loose on his frame, yet despite that, he was never weak when he took to the stage, but raged with an energy that could ignite 10,000 hearts with merely a screamed word. Lank hair fell about his face like a hood, ringleted and black, unwashed yet lustrous in a way that many women envied. This emaciated appearance had led to his nickname, the Cretin. It had become something of a stage persona, part of the act, but he thought it suited him well. Form betrays function, he thought, and again the dark smile came to his lipless mouth. He was waiting for the light to die. There was no necessity in this. It was simply when he liked to perform his rite in the twilight place. The stuttering light pollution of New York was already fighting with the encroaching darkness. It was true that the city lights looked like a field of stars, but where Jed was heading, the stars shone red and dark, not white. Where Jed was heading, New York was but its own faded dream.